we have today's session on documentary crediting, which is, a kind of far more important issue than it may seem at first glance. It's at the heart of so many disputes and ruptures in friendships and collaborations because people don't work out their credits properly. And also there's that whole thing of in this profession that we're in that, doesn't exactly pay a king's ransom. Credits are really our currency in a way. So it's really important to work out what proper credits should be, and make sure that people get credits that they deserve. So it's been an important function, one of many, that the Documentary Producers Alliance, or DPA, has been working through, creating guidelines, and they recently did a survey as well that, and we have from there two special guests, Ray Nowosielski. Ray? Yeah?
Nailed it.
Okay. That was a toughie. And Gordon Skinner, longtime D-Word ambassador, Gordon Skinner is with us. I will just briefly give their one sentence bio so that they don't have to do it themselves. Ray is a longtime producer for Barbara Koppel, co-chair of DPA's crediting committee, two-time news and documentary Emmy-nominated filmmaker, journalist, two-time Image Award-nominated podcast creator and host. Gordon is a longtime producer, director, founder, and executive producer of Reframe Media, full-service production house, and far most important of all, D-Word ambassador. So guys, I see no better way to start this out. You have a PowerPoint that you made up for that kind of gave takeaways of the survey that you did recently. Actually, Ray, best you describe it. Why don't you tell us what we're about to look at? And it also brings up several questions that we will save to the end of the presentation. We'll go back to, and then there's a bunch of questions I have, and I hope a bunch of questions you guys have, because we'll probably devote the last half hour or so to any questions that you guys might have. So Ray, Gordon, take it away.
Thanks for what you do, Doug. Thanks to all of you at the D-Word. It's super important, and that's why we wanted to turn to y'all. This has never been publicly released. The Documentary Producers Alliance conducted this internal survey last year. These results have gone out to members, but if you're not in the DPA, you've never seen this before. And since I'm co-chair of the crediting committee, for which Gordon is extremely, perhaps the most active member, I do feel the need to kind of give a little credit here. So by way of history, for those who don't know, DPA was formed in 2016. Its current president is Erica L. Taylor. One of the most exciting things, and I think still the most sort of talked about piece that has come out of DPA to date, was the 2019 crediting guidelines. And that was done by people who, that was not me. I think Eden Wormfeld, Beth Levinson, Josh Penn, and a number of others put that out. And I think it's important to have something that people in the industry can point to and say, well, this organization says it's supposed to go like this. About 2 years ago, Rachel Bozich, who's known for the Murdaugh murders and a few other amazing projects, she and I connected as just DPA members over stories of crediting issues that a lot of people in our producing circles were telling us about, and they seem to have kind of a pattern to them. And so, long story short, the kind of the old guard of the crediting committee was leaving, and they suggested that if we had an energy behind this, that we should lead it, and we became co-chairs, and along with Rebecca Stern, our board liaison, and Gordon, and a number of other active folks, Eric Foreman, Lena Menifee, Loy Almiron, Stephanie Jenkins, who's here, who also co-founded the Alliance of the Archival Producers Alliance, we wanted to do a survey to find out, is this just in our circle? Are we just seeing something that isn't there, or is there some data that could help us find out if there's, some issues to pursue here? And that's when the Research and Data Committee, which was found, Rebecca Ferguson was a big leader there, but Jonathan Goodman Levitt is who helped us work out how to actually do a sort of scientifically accurate survey. And yeah, we did this, and here it is. I'm gonna go ahead and present for the first time ever. Right. So, kind of gave you this already. We had 103 valid and essentially complete responses. So at the time, I believe that was around 1/5 of our membership. So please bear in mind that of everyone out there producing documentary, there's a subsection of devoted people who feel the need to join an organization like the DPA, and of them, about 1/5 felt motivated to take this survey. So I would say this is not, the margin for error here is large, but this is a definite conversation starter and food for thought. There's our purpose. Actually, here, something out of the way. So the intention of the survey and this report on a selection of its results is to raise awareness and incite conversation to challenge documentary industry norms that may be out of date with its realities and lack for equity, to lead in the questioning of longstanding assumptions that may stand in the way of a better future for filmmakers. Now, here was the exact question. Based on your own experience, which phrase do you feel best completes the following sentence? The driving creative force behind most documentary features and docuseries productions is, and 89% of our membership said it was a collaboration between key creatives, directors, producers, cinematographers, editors. Only 10% of our producer membership, who may be a little biased here, felt that the driving creative force behind most documentaries they'd been part of was a director or a director's vision. That has proven to be sort of controversial. We can talk about that later. So, is the film by credit ever appropriate in documentary? My question. So there were 4 types of documentary credits that most stood out from the DPA survey results. And there were a number of things that Rachel and I and Gordon and others had thought that we had experienced or people around us had experienced, and there was no there. But for 4 of these that we were hearing a lot of stories about, there appears to be a there. For director and co-director, 33% felt one or more times I've felt I should have received this further credit, but I never received it. So to us, that raises the question, what is the threshold for a party who is not the contracted director on a documentary production to also be credited as director? For those of you who have some hot takes on these issues, we're going to be, after this presentation with Doug, with Gordon, we're going to be going back to some of these questions, so you'll have a chance to field your thoughts. For writer or co-writer, additional writing, or similar, 33%, one or more times, I felt I should have received this further credit, but I never received it. So what work on a nonfiction production constitutes quote unquote writing and should be credited as such? I think that is an extremely complex question and probably answer. So for researcher, 33%, one or more times I felt I should have received this further credit beyond producer, but I never received it. And similarly, archival producer, archival researcher are similar. 30%, one or more times I felt I should have received this further credit, but I never received it. So Should significant research and or archival collection fall within the quote unquote producer credit de facto? Should it all get rolled in, as it tends to be done often? Or should it result in an additional credit? And there's a reciprocal to that, which is, when do significant research and or archival collection contributions perhaps justify a producer credit? When do they rise to that level? All right, now, we also asked, have you ever asked for and been denied a better credit and or additional credit on a documentary feature or docuseries after playing a more significant role than was agreed upon when you joined the production? And for 40% of folks, that's a yes. Do you believe, and this is critical, do you believe a failure to be credited properly on a documentary feature or docuseries has ever negatively impacted your ability to get a better job later on another project? All right, so 52%, that's a no, but 47%, that's a yes. That's the belief. So there's forms of crediting beyond the credit roll, and this is a big issue we try to recognize on the DPA crediting committee. So the next questions pertain to that. As a documentary producer on a production where you were not also a director, have you ever felt less welcome than a director at a film festival in which your documentary feature or docuseries was screened? Is that resonating with anyone in the audience? I imagine it may be. So 77%, yes.
Those 22% are smoking, are just lying to themselves.
Well put. Okay, so here's one that's near and dear to my heart because I also consider myself a journalist and I don't like lazy journalism. Has a journalist or film critic ever interviewed you for a piece about a documentary feature or docuseries for which your contributions were credited as producer and not a director? So, okay, I was actually surprised 42% have been interviewed for one of their films as the non-credited director, but 57% never gotten a question on any of their films that they produced but didn't direct from a journalist. You know, hey, I just talked with the director. They gave us this story. Were you there for that? Anyway. As a documentary producer, have you ever been excluded from a list of nominees for an award when you felt you should have been included? 46% felt they should have been included on some industry award that they had earned as part of that production that they were excluded from. I find that very interesting and troubling. As a producer, have the actions by anyone you perceived as more powerful or important than you ever led to your acting more cautiously in promoting your own work during a project's main release? 60% yes. And we formulated that question mostly thinking about social media and pressures about how you post about your own projects, but it wasn't in the question, so it can be interpreted various ways. So we believe strongly that often the credit rolls, are signed off on or often designed by producers themselves. And so there's a duty to also look at other documentary team members and what issues they've been raising about crediting. And so in talking with some of our brother and sister organizations, we found a few interesting ones we wanted to point out during this presentation. So did you know the Alliance of Documentary Editors, the ADE, advocate via their deal memos, if producer and editor agree that a writer or written by credit is not accurate for this picture, then such credit will not be issued. However, if at a later date producer decides to add a credit of writer or written by, then editor must be credited as well with equal billing as all other writers on the picture, which I think there's probably a lot of doc producers who aren't aware of that dictate. And this one's interesting. Editor and producer agree that the act of editing a non-scripted documentary is, in essence, writing, to be discussed. Same might be raised about what a producer's contributing on that front. But did you know the ADE also advocate in their deal memos, if other lead editors are engaged, editor's credit may appear on a card shared with other lead editors, and the order of such credits shall correspond to the level of creative influence of each editor on the final cut of the picture. How many of you are thinking of a film in which you put out the editor card on a credit roll that did not correspond to that? I certainly can. With the highest level to be in first position and with such determination to be made in good faith by company, non-lead editors shall receive additional editing by credits in the end scroll. All right, now did you know the Documentary Cinematographers Alliance, the DCA, advocate via their website, the definition of director of photography cinematographer credit should be reserved for the cinematographer who sets the look of the film and or undertakes the majority of the shooting. Note, this can be a shared credit, and we recommend discussing this with your cinematographers ahead of time. Now, by contrast, additional cinematography credit should be reserved for cinematographers who shoot on the documentary once the look has been set by the film's principal DP, but who are not supervised by or directed in the field by that cinematographer during the course of their shoot. And finally, camera operator or additional camera credit should be reserved for cinematographers who work on the film under the direction or supervision of the principal DP, whether or not their footage appears in the final film. I imagine there may be some in this audience who are thinking that whether or not their footage appears in the final film thing has possibly not been represented in some of the credits that they have put out. And lastly, and Stephanie, I apologize if at some point on this you want to voice further from the APA, but the Archival Producers Alliance advocate via their 2025 guide that the archival producer expects to track and draft end credits for archival assets, and also possibly establish whether any archival team member's credit will be above the line or below the line. So how many of us are checking with our archival producers to clear some of those aspects of crediting while we're designing those? So we got 4 best practices at this point that have not been officially signed off on by the board, but as a committee we think are sound and that everyone here should consider. Producers should strive to ensure that all parties who provide work on the production of the documentary film or nonfiction series have a contract or deal memo before they begin work that includes intended credits. But you're not done there. For all contracts negotiated at the start of production, producers should ensure contracts state that credit can be revised if duties fulfilled change over production, which I think gets to the heart of the survey. Now, this one seems so common sense. I would hope that most of us do it, but I think a lot of us don't. Upon reaching picture lock, producers should provide notification to all parties to be credited with their intended credits, allowing time for potential dispute, which shall be resolved in good faith, because we're all people of honor in this industry, right? And lastly, though, let's not leave out the people who worked on the film but aren't going to be credited. Upon reaching picture lock, producers should provide notification to all parties who provided any services to that production, but who will not be receiving a credit, allowing time for, again, potential dispute, which can be resolved in good faith. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ray. Gordon, did you want to go back to some of the questions that came up that we kind of skipped over because we were trying to make it more presentation?
Sure. I think, yeah. Thanks, Doug. One of the things I was going to also add at the onset is that I'm the chair of the DEI subcommittee, and there are definitely lots of questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion that warranted my participating in this subcommittee. And some of the things we can definitely talk to. But 2 points that came out, something I think that Ray and I have discussed in depth, which is the story producer credit and understanding how that will affect not only writing credit, but also the credits down the line. And also the impact of streaming platforms in dictating what credits should be given from their perspective and those that weren't being looked over. So those were, 2 things that, Ray, you may want to.
Gordon, do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you mean by story producer? Because most producers I've worked with, we talk story all the time. They're in the edit room, they look at cuts, we discuss story. Would that be considered story producer? I just consider some producers are better at working with the director and on the creative end of it, and some are more, attuned to the finances and putting finances together. They just have their strengths and weaknesses. So what stance do you have on or define the term story producer?
Well, it's not a position that I hold that I'm locked in on. It's more something that we've been subjected to by various streaming platforms as opposed to saying this person is straight out a producer. They will then say this person is a story producer or this person is only working in post. They want to limit the amount of credits. This is what we've been finding, and have come up with certain terms which either are innocuous at best, or let me just say that it has been introduced by specific platforms such as YouTube, Hulu, which has raised a lot of questions, and the Writers Guild took exception to that story producer credit as opposed to written by. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I guess it makes more sense for a limited series or an ongoing series than maybe a one-off independently produced documentary, perhaps.
Probably, but again, there's a lot of pushback, where individuals who have been writing and deserve the credit, it doesn't necessarily mean that the WGA is accepting everybody as new members, and so we shouldn't go in believing that, okay, well, I've gotten a writing credit, I immediately should be given, membership into. That doesn't necessarily always hold true.
Mm-hmm.
Ray, you want to elaborate on it?
Yeah, so I apologize. I was actually, while I was giving the presentation, there were about a zillion comments that were coming into the side here, and I was actually working on responding to those. But I apologize, what's the central topic? I won't let that happen again.
Talking about story producer.
The story producer that we talked about the other day. I mean, that one's interesting because it seems like story producer has a whole different definition in reality TV, and then it's sort of growing into the doc world. I had mentioned to you, Gordon, that in my because I spent the last decade working with a wonderful director and producer named Barbara Koppel. Towards the end of my tenure, I was actually fighting for, I guess, what was theoretically the lower credit, because I'd been getting producing credits and that's what I was doing. But because I hadn't been getting writing credits on a lot of docs and I wanted to be seen more as a writer, I started fighting for the story producer thing, thinking that was a good direction for my career to go in. But I think that one is Wild West, and one that I know the committee is sort of looking into further, and probably would have been nice to have in the survey.
Yeah. Well, speaking of writing credits, one of the more interesting ones in my mind is, is the editor in a documentary considered a writer? I give all my editors co-writer credit because I consider that we are, in essence, scripting the film in the edit, and that it's an acknowledgement of the role that they play. I would also say that, many of the films that I've seen either produced or worked on in some way or know of, the editor probably should be given co-director credit because they are so integrated and involved in creating the ultimate documentary. So where do you draw the lines on editors getting writing credit or acknowledging a role that they play that is bigger than just an editing credit?
Well, let me jump in on that quickly,
Sure.
Doug. So there's an example, a very substantial document. Let me rephrase that. An important documentary, which was Bus 174, which was made in Brazil as a result to a hijacking. The editor suggested to the director the importance of rather having the hostages rely on their memory, that they would put them in a black box room and play for them all of the news camera footage, so it would actually help them remember what they had experienced. The director felt so strongly of that participation that he gave the editor a co-directing credit. I wonder, if would that be afforded other places, specifically in the U.S., if an editor had that type of significant contribution, would the director, and even if the director did, would that be accepted and approved by either the producer and or the platform that it's going to be broadcasting?
But Gordon, that brings up the question of why hasn't the DPA put in co-director credit in their guidelines? They put in every other, co-credit except co-director. And so why is that?
The DPA or the DGA?
DPA.
Gotcha. Because my understanding is the DGA, which is still in many ways far more powerful and influential, obviously to the film industry than the DPA, do not recognize co-director as a credit. So you either directed or you didn't. You're either on the card or you're not. That's my understanding. Let me know if anyone is aware
Is
of
that why the DPA didn't put it in?
Well,
Because they
so
put
again,
every
I don't know if you
other
heard at the top, but I did not design the original
Right. No, I understand, but like you are part of
1.0.
it now.
So I don't know what their thinking was or what that process was, but I can tell you that we're talking about that question for the 2.0, which we're hoping to have out later this year.
Ray, how does the DGA handle credits for, I mean, there are all sorts of documentaries where a team directs it. I mean, two people direct it from the very beginning.
Right.
How does the DGA handle that credit?
It's just directed by two people's names.
No, totally. Yeah, exactly. It's they
I
prefer
see.
the directed by credit, not like director and then names underneath. So directed by, and it's if you make it onto that card, there's no co. You know what I'm saying?
Got it.
That's
got
how
it.
they recognize that. So you either make it onto that card and you're a director, or and it was directed by XYZ, or it wasn't. Which might be out of date, and we should, what do we think of that?
No, in 2019, I brought it up to the DPA, and it's nice to see two gentlemen represent DPA because when the crediting guidelines came out, I did the math on the names, and it was 80% women, as it
Yeah.
usually is in this industry, and that goes back to the sexism and the power plays, etc. But all those women for the last 6 years, we're in 25 now, just dismissed and didn't want to touch it, and we're like, oh, she's been a problem. And I was like, what is happening here? Is it really that they're so scared to bring up co-director because they're worried about their jobs from the director's point of view? Like, why would you put co-everything except co-director?
Yeah. That's an interesting point. By the way, my co-chair is Rachel Bozich, who had wanted to make it. I believe she's either traveling or on a shoot at the
She's in
present
DC.
time, but
She's in
But
DC for
she also
docket.
would not have answered it with all due respect, just like you two are not really answering it.
well, I mean, the thing is, there are standards, and the question is, do you want to deviate from those standards and create confusion in the industry, or do you want to try to stick to the standards that exist and try to, get more radical on a few that you really want to see change? So it's interesting that that's so near and dear to your heart, that rather than be included on directed by card, that the idea of a co-dash makes so much sense to you.
Well, when you say standard, with all due respect, the standards were set in very problematic ways. So when I hear men tell me, well, that's the way it is, or that's how the standards were, the whole point of putting out a new crediting guideline is because the standards are not working.
Well, so for instance, just to give you more on that, I mean, we're as I mentioned, in the works on accrediting 2.0, and right in the midst of this, so we're having meetings with different organizations to see where they stand. Right in the midst of this, the Producers Guild of America puts out their new definitions for a lot of these producing roles, including in documentary. So now we are having to figure out how many of those do we just leave in place the way they defined it so as to not create confusion where it need not be, or competing definitions that might not be helpful, or where do we fight and say, I don't really like where the PGA came to on this particular, credit. So we're figuring that out.
I think one of the most important things that came up out of the presentation was at the very end when they talked about the importance of coming to agreements before you begin over what the credits will be, and then re-examining them when the film is towards the finish line, before it's the final credits are put on the film. So that there's a very clear understanding. It's funny, a lot of editors don't want to be given co-director credit. They kind of like the anonymity of being editor. I've talked about it. They appreciate being given co-writer credit. But a number of them said, I want all the blame to go to you, not to me. So I think it's often just an individual case. These are guidelines, and if you come to an understanding that everybody agrees with and is happy with, You know, I mean, I think that gets at the heart of it. And, you know, I've seen more friendships torn apart by misunderstandings over credits, or when somebody leaves the production early because they had to get a job, you know, and their best, you know, we'll split everything. We're co-directors, co-producers, we're going to split the profits. And they don't even make you know, define what profits will be when you make a profit or not. So communication, it seems to me, is like the most important thing that a producer can do, or a director can do. So,
If someone gets miscredited, is there a punishment or grievance policy? I just saw that one pop up. Yeah, if you're a member of one of those unions, right? If you're DGA, there is or if you're WGA. And in particular, if you're protected by a contract at the top, then yeah, there's I'm blanking on the term for it, but there's a process where you can turn to your union. But if that's not the case, then really the grievance process, well, that's why we advocate trying, and I know it's hard because we all want money and we all want the job. But so you don't want to be the pain at the beginning who makes somebody, you know, negotiate and sign a contract if you think that's going to cause you to lose the gig. But, you know, that's the safest way to do it. That way, you know, otherwise it's all about communication, right? I mean, along the way, the best thing you can do is say, hey, I feel I'm doing this. Am I going to get credited for that? And talk with whoever the power people who are going to be those deciders. But unfortunately, there's not like a government entity that you can you know, send who's going to figure that out for you. So if you're not in the union, it's problematic.
Well, it could be helpful, don't you think, to recommend that over these grievances or issues, you will not sue each other. You agree that you will take this to California Lawyers for the Arts mediation. I mean, ITVS does that. That's another thing in their contract. They have a basic outline. You're not going to sue each other. You're not going to waste our money to sue each other, because that's usually how people with money threaten others and take what's there. You know what I mean? More than what's theirs. But you can just add a line as a recommendation that you will literally in your contract, you're not going to sue each other. You're going to go to California Lawyers for the Arts, $50 per person mediation. And I've asked DPA that. Why haven't you added that? Look at ITVS. They've added that. And again, they just wouldn't touch that, which is really unfortunate, because just that little line can save people a lot of, you know, the person with more money gets, you know, whoever can out-lawyer the other, you know, gets what they want. So that's unfortunate as well. Like something as little as that recommendation is too much for the DPA to touch. Because they all recommend to each other, oh, get a lawyer. But lawyering up is not the answer. Lawyering up is part of the problem, right? You got to discourage that culture of lawyering up.
Yeah. Well, we'll take note and we'll bring it back to DPA. But, you know, these organizations, unfortunately, you know, they're run by committees, they're run by boards. Essentially, there's a lot of different parties, and you've got to form some version of consensus. And a lot of these are either low paid or voluntary out of love positions. And so I think inside the DPA, they're picking their battles, and the things that are considered sort of the most pressing to the, you know, everyone are making it through first.
Yeah, but do you think it's not pressing to not promote lawyer culture? Like, that's pretty important to change the culture, right? Because that's been part of the problem. Like, again, that's how it's been dismissed for the last 6 years. So I hope it'll change in the next version.
Well, I think it's very pressing, unless you give me a list of 50 other issues facing doc filmmakers right now, and I got to rate them, and then it might end up somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure if you put that in your survey, not threatening each other with lawyers would come up as top 50 for sure, if not top 10.
Might have to go in the next survey.
So I'd like to get back into the producer credit for a moment, and dig deeper into what distinguishes a co-producer from a producer, or a co-producer from an associate producer. Does DPA have very distinct guidelines on that?
Yes, and rather than rattle through all of them, I'd rather put them. Let me put them in the chat here, or anyone that wants to search them out too. But I'll put them in the chat. It was the crediting guidelines from 2019. Now that may be changing as we move forward through the end of the year, but I'm a little reticent to comment on these definitions. Honestly, I'd rather stick with kind of. I'd like to get feedback from the group here on some of the things that were in some of the issues raised in the survey.
Well, do you want to go back to the questions that were in it, that we skipped over while we were doing?
Yeah, because
Okay.
I was really hoping we could kind of, because how people react and what people bring up on this at this event, I think is going to help guide which things we decide to push forward based on the survey and which things that we choose to leave behind. So
Gordon, do you have that lined up? What some of those?
I don't. I've been trying to track it exactly, but the one thing
Maybe
I
if you go
did,
through the PowerPoint and come up, and go to them as they come up.
but also the other thing that we wanted to see happen is for individuals to share from their experiences
yeah,
any of these that are touch or pain points.
Here we go, film by. What do you think, folks?
what do we think?
Of course it is.
If you have a film by credit, wouldn't the director credit fulfill that? Is that a duplicate? What's the
Yeah, and
difference?
like, I'm curious, why would a credit that's used in the narrative world or the film industry in general not be appropriate in documentary? Like, I don't understand why it wouldn't.
Yeah.
I also want to ask what kind of
Can I address that? I
Yeah,
think
and then Hannah will get to you because you got.
AK, do you go by AK or AK? AK, nice to see you. I think you make a very good point. I think the major distinction is that we're covering people's lives. So a film by in fiction was created inside the head of somebody, director, writer, producer, somebody envision a world. But documentaries are going into the world, and those people exist on their own with or without the film. So saying a film by, for me at least, and I know I don't have a lot to I mean, I worked in a ton of films, and I can tell you there is an immediacy and a respect, and being exposed to European thinking, there is a lot of, now they're not called subjects or character, now they're called collaborators, because that's the ethical thing to do. So for me, a film by sounds a little bit like somebody created these people in their head, and these people existed before a camera was turned on. So I'm not saying this as a counterpoint to what you're saying. I think we should consider these are people's lives that we're covering.
No, we get that. I mean, even a lot of narrative films are made about people's lives because there was a documentary made and then they adapted it. But regardless, my participants in my film did not tell the story this way. They were in fact surprised. Oh my God, I didn't know you could tell the story this way. They didn't think it was an important enough story that people would care. So I am making that film, and that is a film by me. And if I had a collaborator who really helped shape it, it would also be a film by them. So I think it's definitely appropriate, regardless in documentary. I don't think any credit, it's a film at the end of the day. Of course, dialogue scripting is not something that works in documentary, perhaps, and it does a narrative. But besides that, I don't see.
I see you're very adamant about this point.
I'm exposed to a non-European way of thinking. Perhaps that's why.
Hannah, you had something to say.
Yeah, I think Fernanda highlighted something very important, because I was just asking, when we say a film by XYZ person, right? What is the value? What are we trying to convey? Because even within documentary world, documentary production processes and how they come to life on a screen, there are very different processes. Sometimes a documentary is literally willed by the director, who not just funds it, but also like writes it, films it, and everything, right? And I feel like in some way, a film by credit should really go to someone who has really like made an effort to bring the film to life. But I also sort of like, Fernanda has given a lot of stuff for me to think about, because yes, we're dealing with real life people, real life stories, because yes, we go and we film with them, but their stories continue before we meet them and after the film is done and we move on, right? So
So it's
what
not about
value we are
their
trying
lives.
to, you know.
Yeah, but the film's a static thing, right? Sure, their lives continue, but that film is not changing. There could be another film made about them later, but this film is instead is now happening because we made it, and
Can
that's
I
what we're
give a,
talking about. That film is by the person who made it. Of course, everybody's lives continue beyond.
can I give one take on this? So I feel like I don't know if the auteur theory that developed in the mid 20th century was ever accurate, even in narrative film. But in my experiences of documentary production, it's particularly collaborative in a way that I find isn't recognized by a film by a single person. And obviously, there may be many exceptions, but a cinematographer, right, may have a good idea, have received direction on kind of the stylistic elements of how they're going to shoot an observational scene. But when they're in it and they're shooting that scene, they're making a lot of both creative and journalistic choices. Um, and in the same way, an editor who doesn't have a script like in narrative film may get 300 hours collected over 4 years with a kind of a rough outline. And then they go and through their creativity, figure out scenes and sequences and sort of form the thing. And producers, in many cases, if you're working with a successful documentarian who's working multiple projects, which often happens, maybe doing many of the interviews that end up in the film. Maybe the lead creative, out getting observational. Again, understanding the direction of the director. To me, it's not minimizing that the director is not contributing what we think they are. It's maximizing that the rest of the team may be contributing more than what sort of this public perception based around that auteur theory does. And so I do wonder if in doc specifically the question is a little more legitimate around this a film by and where it should be used.
Ray, what stood out to me, one of the things that stood out was the question of, is it driven by the director or is it collaborative, a documentary? And it seemed to be like an either or question. When I would say, generally speaking, in my experience, it's initiated by the director. It's leaping off from the director's vision, and then of course it's a collaboration as you move along. So it feels far more blended than an either or question to me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that sentiment. The one thing that's been emerging as we've had early conversations around this is it can get very almost intense. And I've sort of seen what areas seem to be the triggers. And there's this perception that if we're promoting, so our organization's a producer-based organization. So if we're promoting that producers are filmmakers, that somehow we're denigrating that the director is not contributing this amazing visionary whatever to it. And I don't think it should be an either or. I think most directors would probably recognize that it shouldn't be and isn't, right?
And to be clear that, while we've been talking about, what the DPA has been proposing, understand that we're also been battling against the PGA. And so that's another entity that doesn't really fully appreciate everything that DPA is attempting to do. And so I think that, that should also be taken into consideration as we come up with these issues.
Ray, do we want to line up the next question that was in the?
Yeah, sounds great. Let's see here. Okay.
There we go.
What is the threat? Yeah.
Well, somebody put in the chat that I think that they felt like they contributed over 50% to. Oh, I think that was a writer credit we were talking about. That's an interesting question, and to me it gets back to, the editor being considered, a director or co-director.
Yeah, can I say that we are assuming that everybody in a team has the same level of experience here? And I think part of the problem is that sometimes a very new director full of vision hires a 30-year-old editor or a 30-year career editor solving a lot of things, and it's still a collaboration, but sometimes the opposite happens too. So I think part of the issues we're having, and again, I have a vision that is in the indie world, in certain geographies. I'm not trying to say this is true for absolutely everybody in the world. I'm saying that at least in my corner, I see the credit issues come from a big discrepancy of experience. And then it's not the same a director who is hiring ultra experienced people, then director editor are kind of equal, and therefore it's a true collaboration. And the same goes for writer. You know, when a writer has a lot of experience and works with a newer director, it's not taken away from the vision, but clearly there was a level of input that is very skewed, and it can happen the other way around. A director can work with a very new editor and teach and form that editor. So I think part of the problem is assuming that all working models are equal and everybody in the team. It's not the same as the director. I just talked to somebody this morning. She dropped the footage with the editor and said, see you in 3 weeks. That's a different type of editor than the one you hand a paper edit. So I think part of the discussion here is that we're comparing pears and apples and working models and levels of experience that are very different, and clarifying that in a team. Maybe that should be something to add. Clarify not only the roles, but what is the working model for this team and levels of experience. And that will already probably, at least in my teams, creative teams I managed, it clear a lot of the pressure. When we're not talking about vision, we're talking about other things, working models, to call it something. The director for me always has the vision, and I will never argue with that. But then that director has a working model and joins or forms a team with different levels of expertise and experience. It's almost a question I'm asking to the rest.
What if a new vision is created due to the collaborators, a whole new vision? Projects pivot all the time. And if a previous vision wasn't funded and the new vision that's completely pivoted funds, then clearly those people's contribution is at par with director sometimes. And that's where the co comes in.
There's the famous Superman 2 example where Richard Lester was taking over for the fired, or I think he'd left, Richard Donner. And because Donner had shot Superman 2 sort of alongside Superman 1, Lester had to go back until he hit 40% of the scenes that were in the film had been shot by him, even though they only needed like 20%. So that based on DGA's rules, he could be credited as director, and then he should have been it should have been directed by Richard Donner and Lester, but Donner didn't want any part. He said, I don't co-direct, something to that effect, and so he had his name removed. So it ultimately was 40% of it was directed by Lester, but he got the credit. But I mean, so again, that's that word threshold, right? Like, and that's what guidelines and things like this do, I find, is I'm seeing a lot of questions about like, well, where are you supposed to turn to enforce XYZ? I personally don't think it's as much about that as it is about having a document that's recognized by a major organization in the industry where someone who's fighting a fight within a production can say, I don't know, you weren't on 40% of these scenes that made it in the film, and I actually was, but I'm getting credited as producer. Is that appropriate? The DPA says it isn't, but I think we should all discuss. I don't know what the threshold is. That's why I'm very interested to hear. I think our committee is very interested to hear what y'all think.
Doug, may I ask if it's okay? Are we supposed to comment as we go along, or just wait until the end?
No, I think it's a free-for-all, Sheila.
Okay. I wanted to say that I think that Fernanda made a very important point based on my experience, but I think you did too. And I think when you talked about having a deal memo or a contract at the beginning, because in our experience, I'm a producer and a director, and my husband partner is a very experienced director, writer, and years of editing both features and documentaries. And also we both consult. And what I find oftentimes, particularly with consulting when projects come to us, is that what we are told when people are looking to hire you doesn't comport. I mean, the person is not being dishonest, but doesn't comport with the reality of where they are with the film or what they have. And so, Doug's point, I think complements Fernanda's very well, because when you talk about your contract and your deal memo thoroughly, if you really don't just, if you take it seriously, there's a process, and you can come to an understanding of where the film is at, and then be, more collaborative and arrive at better credits. So.
Yeah. Look, a lot
I
of.
wonder, sorry, Doug, can I
No, go
add
ahead.
something? I wonder if it might make sense, besides guidelines, create some sort of questionnaire for people to use before contracting, or as a way of contracting people, like experience, relevance, timing. Sometimes I hear from people that say, well, but this person came at the last minute. I said, yeah, but without that person, you couldn't finish because you didn't know what else to do. So that person came last, but was vital for the project to be finished. And if not that, some other with equal expertise. So sometimes I think we need some self-assessment and understand the team. And I wonder, again, I'm just throwing something out there, I might be too crazy and too touchy-feely, to have a questionnaire that helps people evaluate experience, relevance, the rest of the team, and then the deal memo come as a result of something that fits that team, rather than a blank slate or guidelines that try to encompass too many variables. I think the issue is there is and I say this with love, a low entry bar for filmmaking, and that's good. We need all voices in, but that also makes a very huge mix of people trying to get together and work things out. And maybe before guidelines and before deal memos, we need some assessment tool to help people understand who they are working with and what are the variables.
Christine, you've been very politely had your hand raised for a while.
Yeah. Thanks. I first of all, I really appreciate this topic and the interactivity of it. Going to the first, I think it was the first question you put up about the collaborative aspect of this. I'm a big believer in that. And Fernanda, what you just said about timing or relevance, really, I think is really important. And as an example, I brought on someone who really had post-production, that's his sweet spot, but he also has been an editor. But I made him the producer because absolutely without him, I mean, so I really felt that he was taking on more. So I wanted to give him that credit, and I also thought that he was at a point where he could do that. The question about the threshold thing about the director, I have a sort of a riff on that. In my case, I wanted to articulate that I'm not a contracted director, that the project came from me. So I have put creator and director. I don't need that. My only goal was to try to say that I'm not, that I'm sort of leading, I'm the owner of the LLC. I'm leading that, but I'm not taking a producer credit because I don't want a whole bunch of credits. So that's one of my questions. Another question is very intentionally, I wanted my DP to be my lead editor. And he's also co-writer. I mean, I'm a first-time director. So again, I'm very collaborative. So do I list him 3 times or do I list him once, or so I'm just wondering in terms of that kind of situation.
Christine, go back to the first one when you said you're creator and director.
Yeah,
you
creator.
You said you had a question, but I
creator.
wasn't quite sure what your question was.
Well, my question is should I put creator and director, or should I just be director? But I'm wanting to convey the fact that this is not something that I was hired to do.
I'm no expert on this. I would just say, why not just director, and then your director's statement talk about originating the project or something, or save that for interviews and stuff. I mean,
well, that's why I'm asking the question, but obviously an audience isn't going to see a director's statement, and I don't know that it matters. So yeah, that's why
I see created all the time on TV, particularly for like the series. Created by, particularly fiction series, I see creator all the, created all the time, created by,
sort of
and
like
then
story
written
by.
It's a kind of, I don't think I've seen it too often in documentaries, particularly standalone feature documentaries.
Yeah. So I just wasn't sure that, how to articulate the fact that I that I wasn't hired to do it.
I would question why. I can see why you don't want like a lot of different credits, but it seems to me not taking on a producer credit because you don't want so many credit when you are the creator of it. I don't understand why you'd be reluctant to take producer credit.
Okay.
As your therapist, what's going on there, Christine?
Well, I think you made the distinction, Christy. This is Sheila again, that you want to convey that you're not paid.
Yes.
Right. So that's odd to me because in our world of documentaries,
Nobody gets paid.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not being it's not that I'm not being paid. Well, I'm not right now, but it's that I wasn't hired. That's my point.
Yeah.
But isn't the producer the creator? They may not have written the story. They may not have directed the film, but they created the whole situation where the film gets produced.
It varies, Joanne, from film to film. Some are, some aren't. I always initiated, I have a producer credit as well as director, but I take on a producer and I always give them a separate producer credit as well. My credit is generally directed and produced by, and then there's a separate producer produced by.
Okay. That makes sense.
But there's no formula for this. This is why we want guidelines.
Yeah.
Right.
And my other question that I put in the chat is, and this may seem naive, do all these credits matter to the audience?
No, they matter to the careers.
Like Netflix doesn't even give you time to read a credit.
They
They're
matter to us
they're
and
off
they
to
matter-
their next one.
Right, because people always ask me, oh, you were a producer. What does a producer do? Or they don't ask at all. They just want to see the film and enjoy it and see that a bunch of people worked on it.
What a great question for Ray and Gordon. What do producers do?
People without power don't care. People with power care.
We've dealt with
Maybe
that
that's
one
it,
before,
people
Doug,
with
but
power care.
Yeah.
But
And
Joanne,
Netflix
you
doesn't
asked a
care
question.
because, they pay. So if you get
Joanne,
paid.
Yes,
excuse me, okay. Joanne, you asked a question about interviewer.
yes.
Can you repeat
Oh.
that one?
The question was, should there be a credit for the person who asks the questions during the course of the film? Should that credit be interviewer? It may be a producer or a director or somebody else, but should there be a separate interviewer credit for the person who asks the question?
So I mentioned there were certain areas that the crediting committee thought there might be a there, and then when we put it in the survey, didn't really find much traction. So we honed in, where there did seem to be. And one of those was I kind of liked the idea of, along the lines of what you're saying, like a journalist or journalism by credit. I find often that the journalist who's not the director, but does classic journalism or develops a story from scratch rather than having it officially adapted, right? In this documentary, they just get lumped into producer. And to your point, a lot of things get lumped into producer. And there's this question as to when it may be appropriate to indicate that, well, this person, there's so many jobs that go into producer, but it seems to me that if you're the primary journalist on the film and that comes through in the film, but you weren't the director, you weren't sort of the stylistic visionary, then like what, there should be some way to indicate that you contributed in this way that might not just simply be lumped into kind of the many definitions that fall within producer.
Yeah, so maybe we should create another credit for the producer who doesn't, who for the interviewer who rarely gets seen in a documentary, but is occasionally heard. And even if you're not heard, the people who answer the questions are responding to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And that somebody would be the interviewer.
Well, I'll jump in for a minute. In my experience, it's always the director who gets the the job of doing the interviewing, and sometimes, again, the editor or the writer. In which case, I think they should share. If it's minimal, maybe a co-directing, but if it's an equal or greater contribution, then it should be directed by two people.
Gary brought up an interesting question with regard to being an editor and has written more than 50%. I think I put that in the chat for Doug and for Ray to address.
That issue, I think it's different on different productions. Also, I think the more active the director is, I think we've all seen these directors who, God love them, happy for their success. They're putting out 3 films a year, 5 films a year. I would put out there that it's absolutely impossible that they're doing all the interviews or on site for all the observational. And so they're relying on their producers. And one can say, well, then is the producer directing, or is the producer following the directing guidance of the director without the director present? And I think these are legitimate things to discuss and figure out what we think is fair and where we draw the line.
I think that's why making assessments, creating questionnaires that help people go deeper should. I'm happy to contribute to that, having worked in over 1,000 films from writer, story producer, all that. I've been in many rooms, sometimes mediating these issues and sometimes being the victim or taking advantage of this issue. I've been in every position. I think we are overdue for questionnaires that help people articulate well what's the working model, who are the people they're working with. I don't think we should in the future push for guidelines. They will never be encompassing for such a diverse business. They will never work. What works for indie doesn't work for TV. What works for artisan director that is micromanaging, it's not the same as the overviewer. So I think coming up with an assessment questionnaire for people to kind of own where they are and who they're with would be, and maybe now I'm going crazy, I'm married to an IT guy. I think if you click, it gives you the guidelines that work for your team or what would be fair or to consider. I think those guidelines should result in something that answers that particular or help that particular team, because there are many ways of directing, there are many ways of doing everything in this business, and we will never find the guidelines that accommodates absolutely everybody.
Fernanda, can you share about your experience as story producer versus producer?
Yes, I work, again, when I mention other places, I just want to first, D-Word is an international organization, and I want to acknowledge that it's not just the US people. There are people out there, members of the D-Word, that are bound to other rules and other issues. So I want to be inclusive to people who are not within the US umbrella. I understand the DPA serves US, but there are other people out there who could benefit from this. The story of writing in documentaries is very fraught, as you all know, because it's associated with the writing of voiceover from a white male in the 1950s, a voice of God saying everything you should understand about this film. And then the Nouvelle Vague and the direct cinema happened. And then there is no writer. Nobody is creating this story. It's just reality. So the writing credit has always been very, very complicated because of the history of documentary making. But we're here today. I find on the one end, people don't want to even think there is somebody creating anything in terms of storytelling, because they are hardcore verite people and they are just shooting as it is and blah, blah, blah. Albert Maysles, rest in peace, was the pioneer in that, in making the writer disappear. And then on the other end, you have the person who writes everything and hands the editor a paper edit. So I have to find a way to be acknowledged for my work. In Europe, Northern countries, Scandinavian countries, they have the credit of dramaturgy, meaning structure of the story, and it's not shared with the editor because it's a separate job. So some countries solve that issue with dramaturgy. UK, yeah. Canada makes a distinction between narrated by or narration by and writer. So if somebody writes narration, that's credited separately, and that's how I saved my head a few times by going into narrative, even though I did other things. And then story producer is used in platforms, and it's not that the producer is not telling the story. It's saying that somebody has to write the log, like the synopsis, check the rough cuts for narration, make sure that all stories work together. That's a writer, basically. But because they have overseen power over other departments, it's the story producer. So I'm not talking, and Doug was hinting at this, Doug is not the producer that is going to contribute in story. It's a writer that is going to do project management. And because I do a lot of project management in my teams, I sometimes get credited in those countries as story producer. And writer is, God help you, it's very hard to negotiate because people confuse writing with authorship. And that's where the film by, even though it gives me conflictive emotions, will benefit me, because then authorship will go to that department and it will free up writing as a craft issue, like editor or DP. A writer has a craft. It's not about creation or authorship. So that, in a nutshell, are my thoughts about the writing credits around the world and what are the plus and cons. And maybe we can learn from what other people are doing and how it applies to each person.
That was incredible. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. Ray, have we touched on all the questions that were in the
Not quite.
PowerPoint?
Let's see here.
Any more you want to bring up? I took it off screen share just
Oh,
because
yeah,
it was holding on it forever while people were talking. So.
Okay, very good. So that, let's see. Next one was, well, I mean, exactly what was just brought up. What work on a nonfiction production constitutes writing and should be credited as such? You know, can I give a food for thought that maybe we jump off of from there, kind of following on Fernanda's thought? To me, it was that journalism credit where things get a little blurry between traditional writing and documentary, right? Because you're right, there is a craft to actually crafting the words if it's a narration or something like that. And so you don't want to denigrate the actual craft of writing, but on the other hand, you get credited on a journalistic entity like the New York Times. You get credited for the investigative work that you do in unearthing that and sort of formulating how the flow of the story will go, even if you didn't write it. And I can give one example where early in my time with Barbara Koppel, we got contracted to do a film called Killing the Colorado. And we were one of several that were providing like a short that was going to be part of the larger Discovery Channel film. Well, this was based on a ProPublica series by Abram Lustgarten called Killing the Colorado. And so it was officially adapted, and so Abram got the credit based on Killing the Colorado, written by Abram Lustgarten. And I have fulfilled that role, I feel. on multiple productions where I'm credited solely as producer, but I essentially unearthed that original journalism and story and the characters from scratch. But because it didn't come out first in ProPublica, I don't have that argument to be officially credited as the writer. So it's more of a pretty please, wasn't I kind of the writer here by doing that journalism? And that's something I'd love to see figured out somewhere along the way, but I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that subject.
Yeah, I think again, because I've been in your position a million times and had to navigate it across different cultures and power structures. Don't get me started when TV gets involved. That's a whole other game. But there is the producer who brings contacts, strategy, money. And there is a producer who sometimes the same, who works in the story aspect and is a great sounding board and research on everything, as you say. That's where the British people started to think more of a story producer. Who manages the story? Who's going to supervise, decide, help the director see the light? That's what the story producer is coming from. And I wonder if you had asked for story producer credit separate from producer, because I personally tend to associate producer with a lot of important things, but not managing the writing or managing or supervising archive. In general, I supervise archive and researchers when I have a bigger team, and when I have a small team, it's just me. So I will go back to, we need better questions, not from your survey, questionnaires for self-assessment, because you're a particular type of producer I don't come across very often, which is the producer with a background in journalism. The producers I know have MBAs, or they have other backgrounds and other interests. Even they are not interested in sitting down and researching anything. So you present a very interesting challenge, which is insisting on, we are overdue for questionnaires that help us assess these labels we're creating and how we feel in the information for those labels.
Thank you for that. Doug, I know you wanted, well, I mean, if anyone else has any thought on that, but I know with Stephanie on this next question about should significant research and or archival collection fall within the producer credit de facto or result in an additional credit, is there another way you'd put that or seek out the answer to that question, or anything else you would raise, Stephanie, if you're still on? She co-founded.
I'm not sure. I think she left earlier.
Oh, no. She's interesting because she's on our committee, right, and she co-founded the Archival Producer Alliance. So I was really hoping to get her take on that here. But what do we all think? Like, what is the harm? What is the gain of sort of lumping some of these things into producer versus having the outside credit?
Well, how is the role of archival producer defined as, apart from just archivist or researcher? I assume the archival producer oversees all of the archival, all the people working under.
Our definition on the 2019 guidelines was typically responsible for every stage and aspect related to the archival materials needed for a documentary, including research, acquisition of materials, organizing, budgeting, and final licensing. Here, I'll put the rest of the definition.
To me, where that gets blurry are some of these documentaries that are all archival. Something like the Martha Mitchell Effect, or so many others I've seen recently that are completely archival driven. It gets to be a very blurry line there, I would think.
This is Sheila. I had only seen archival producer on Netflix docs, big ones, World War II and Hitler on Trial. And I like it personally because I think it's a huge job. I mean, and it often falls on the editor, where it would be great to have, a person who is recognized, if you can afford that person, who's in charge of everything that goes into that, keeping track of, you have to keep careful track for copyright reasons and figuring out what kind of rights you can afford and so forth. So I like that credit a lot.
Actually, what I also would like to bring up is where do the credits go in the credits? Like I like to put the editor like one of the top three credits. I will put I put the composer way up there because the music is always so important to my films. I mean, I hate it when really important jobs on a film are buried, in a long crawl and somebody who does so much work on the archival, for instance, is, like the 20th credit down. So I think there's something to be said for that as well, about somehow highlighting them. There's two aspects to crediting. It's how do they get recognized by the audience watching the film? But also, what is the official credit that goes on your IMDb and goes, on your record and your resume? And that's, I think of outsized importance to everybody working is when you feel like you were co-producer and you get consulting producer credit, which happened to me. Or I was like co-DP and I got additional, photography credit. That's where it burns because that's where, the only recourse is to never bring up the film and never talk about it again.
But who's having that impact or if you want to move people's credits up within your film, are you running into challenges with the broadcaster?
I've never had an issue with a broadcaster over where credits were positioned, ever. But that was a big. It was HBO, BBC. Lots of big name broadcasters. I don't think they care unless it's their production. It depends on whether it's an acquisition or a co-production.
Well, I tell you, you will run into serious trouble when a broadcaster gets involved because part of their funding is determined by who are the lead people. And because in many things, I'm the foreigner in their team, because if it's Canada or anywhere else, I don't hold a passport for, they will say, we cannot have that credit because then our funding doesn't fulfill. So it's not only order and all that, broadcasters are tied, key roles will determine funding. So sometimes it's not even that the director doesn't want to or the producer doesn't want to, it doesn't fall into the guidelines of funding for that place. So it's a complicated conundrum that we have. And I've been in situations where there was a version with credits one way for Canada and a version for everything else.
Before we head off, we have about 10 more minutes left. I would like to, I know this isn't part of the survey, Ray, but it's something I pointed out by example in the weeks leading up to this session. Because it's a big one when we're looking for funding. We're always trying to get people on board as executive producers or, co-executive producers or, and a lot of first-time filmmakers will give executive producer credit for somebody who contributes like $5,000 to their campaign. And it, can create serious issues later on. I know DPA has handled certain guidelines for what, how they define, not, I guess define, but like what are the, the tiers, what level. I think it's 10% of the budget, right, to earn executive producer credit?
Yes. Now, look, let's see. Yeah, 10% or greater gets you an executive producer credit. 7.5 to 9.9% gets you co-executive producer. I feel the need to point out, though, the Producers Guild of America has just taken a major stand on this and this year put out some new advocacies, but their position is that the producer credit should be for people who do the nuts and bolts producing as, defined in our crediting guidelines and elsewhere, and should never be sold for any amount. Now, they are even taking the slightly controversial stance, I find among documentarians it's controversial, that there shouldn't even be a selling of the EP credit. That if someone is a contributor of money, they also need to be doing a number of other traditionally executive producing, contributions to the production to have an EP credit. Otherwise, PGA is advocating something like financed by, or we wish to thank our, contributors, or something to that effect, but that there should be no, whether it's executive producer or producer, sale of credits, even, whether it's as part of what's the word? Like either Kickstarter or like direct contribution. And so that it's an interesting point, but it also makes fundraising harder, which is why I find it controversial.
To say nothing of when you have stars or celebrities who are in your film, and their part, their involvement helps move your film from tier to tier.
Right. They're basically just lending their name to it, rather than actual financing. Yep.
Who's to say that doesn't raise money for you?
Or raise the profile of the film.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think. Go ahead, Fernanda.
Thank you. Can I jump in on the?
Yes, Tina, yes, because you have your hand raised. Of course, you take prior.
Yeah, I take it down now. And I'm confused about the title producer. It becomes so many things. You were writing and talking about archival producer. Wouldn't it be better with archival researcher? I mean, archival producer, then producer is like you can name anything, producer. It's so many things.
I think they're distinguishing that they produce the archival aspect of the film, that they are overseeing it. That's to me what that credit implies. Not that they're a producer of the film itself, but, they're not raising money for the film. They're not doing the contracts. They're not getting the errors and emissions insurance, or doing deliverables to the distributor or broadcaster, which is generally the role of the producer, among many other things.
Yeah, but you're still talking about the person that finds the archival material for the film,
or
right?
Oversees the researchers who are finding it, and draws up the contracts, for the archival materials themselves. What I'm saying is that when it's an all archival film and it's so driven by the archive, perhaps then it gets a little blurry at like should they be a producer of the film credit as well? I don't know. I don't have the answer, and I would think it's sometimes it could be a case by case basis, I guess. It's also like, a lot of it goes to the generosity of the filmmakers and the producers. I mean, I'm very big on giving people credits, like I said at the beginning, it's sort of the currency. When we don't pay them what they should be paid because we can't afford to, or even if we do, it's like, what's it to us if we give somebody a credit, err on the side of giving them a bigger credit rather than a smaller credit? I've just been on the other side of very insecure filmmakers who, feel like you have to lose for them to win somehow, or they feel like you'll get all the credit if you are named as a producer somehow. So I will give interns production assistant credits, things like that. I mean, it's just, so it often comes down to that as well.
I mean, the credit roll is real estate. And I always think about, how would I be in this terrain if it wasn't for the contributor? And, what does it benefit me for me not to give a credit to someone, especially if it is either helping them early in their college, their contributions just for mine. I remember giving Nancy Abraham a credit and didn't put down HBO, thinking that I would be able to hide that she was with HBO. and everybody who was Nancy, was HBO involved, and they weren't involved financially in the film. But her contributions were significant for us to even get into Tribeca.
Yeah.
Yeah, to add to the executive producer nightmare, let me add that many people who give feedback, they're not writers, they're just giving feedback, and mainly editors get executive producer because of this taboo of not crediting writers in very textile films. So many people, like prominent editors who don't want to take away from the editor, like some Polar Agencia, they will go as executive producers because they gave feedback, guided a little bit of story producer, a little bit of editing, a little bit of connections, a little bit of recommendations, and they learned that to raise the profile. So the executive producer as writer, those and many others are very nuanced credits that try to embrace a lot of people that don't fit in other places. But I want to thank the DPA, Gordon, because you took on a beast of a challenge. It's a beast. Credits, when they're non-union, is a beast. And I think no matter how difficult and unpleasant, I think in the end, we're going to have more knowledge. And I want you to know that it's worth it, even though the path is very jungly and you're with a machete trying to make it work. So I want to say that in spite of everything that comes out of today, that I commend you for taking this on.
Yes, and I will just say you will get no credit for this either, but we all thank you for taking it on.
Did you say machete or matai?
Machete.
I know.
We are out of time,
Thank you.
folks. Gordon, Ray, thank you. Are there any last words that you have that you'd like to say before we head out into our weekend?
Fernanda, I'd love to get, Gordon, if you agree, get your consult on some of our next steps here. I mean, you too, Doug.
It would be my pleasure, of course, always trying to add wherever it takes us. Thank you for the invitation. I will follow up.
Thank
you. Yeah, and understand that the DPA and the DEI subcommittee, in spite of having Ford pull our funding, Ford is now going to be participating with DEI, and I want to extend that to Doug and to Fernanda, wholeheartedly. Your stewardship over the years has really been invaluable for me and for everybody in our industry.
Well, you're quite welcome. Thank you, guys.